Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the quarter revision for Snyder's Drain. And the first item on the agenda is a motion to appoint a chair. Councillor Hallman.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. I will motion to move you as the chair for the meeting.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
Okay, all in favor? Very good, thank you. And how many appeals do we have listed?
Thank you, through you, Chair Armstrong. No written appeals were received prior to the deadline. However, I believe there are members of the public in attendance who may wish to speak to that.
Okay, so no written and no verbal.
As I said, we have members of the public who are in attendance,
Okay,
who may wish to voice an appeal.
okay, thank you. So, Mr. Miller, if you would review the procedure.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor Armstrong. Good morning, everyone. And yeah, as Don mentioned, it is an option for the Court of Revision if you choose to hear verbal appeals on the spot, more or less, as we move along through the Court of Revision this morning. So what I'll be doing is, in fact, maybe at this point, would it be helpful to just confirm the properties represented by the folks that are in attendance?
That's probably a good idea. Those attending, could you identify yourself and your property? And at the same time, maybe if you could also declare if you have an appeal that you wish to address.
I don't mind starting. Ross Steckley, acting as pro rata agent for the properties owned by Miriam and Bill Weicker. So that would be the William Weicker, I think is how you sent it out. And ours is just a request for you to consider. We are in no way wanting to appeal the process in whole or in part, but the particular situation that the Weickers are in, we're asking for your consideration once I have an opportunity to share.
Okay, thank you.
Snyder. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Mr. Snyder.
Mr. Mayor, Stuart Snyder, 1039 Nassinger. I guess maybe I'm the instigator of this whole situation. I do not want to appeal the process either, but I'm just looking, like Mr. Steckley talked about, considerations on allowances of to how things have been allocated at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. And anyone else?
I'm Brian Kelly. I'm counsel for the estate of the late Ian Elizabeth Schmidt. I'm here as an observer. I'm not making an appeal.
Okay. Thank you, Ron. Okay, I think that's it.
Okay, thank you.
Through you, Chair Armstrong.
Yes.
My apologies, through you, Chair Armstrong. We also have Maurice Good, who is also in attendance. Mr. Good, if you wouldn't mind, please just announcing yourself and also stating the property that you're here to, that you're representing. Are you able to unmute yourself, Mr. Good? Okay, well, Morris Good is also in attendance here today. And if he has any questions or comments, then perhaps he'll chime in at that time. Thank you.
Through you, Mayor Armstrong, if it sounds good, I'll continue.
Yes, please.
Okay. So just to illustrate again on our project map, where the affected properties are that are in attendance today lie within the watershed of the drain. This is Knapsager Road here and Highway 7 and 8. The main route of the drain follows this path south towards the Nith River. Morris Goods property is here, south of Bleams Road, and it's noted here as K. Mayer Holsteins Inc. And then Stuart Snyder's property is north of Bleams Road and east of Knapsager, noted as AgCom Inc. And then the properties owned by the Wykers are 2 parcels north of Schmidt Woods in the rec center area and the highway, listed with their names on those properties. So hopefully that'll at least help us get our bearings. So real quickly, I'm not going to go into more detail than needed at this stage related to how assessments are calculated for drainage projects under the Drainage Act, but I will try to provide an informative summary. So the Drainage Act requires the engineer to take the total cost of the project and distribute it among the affected lands and roads. And the basis for assessing cost is primarily twofold. It's what's known as outlet liability and then what's called benefit assessment. So each of the properties, to varying degrees, are assigned an outlet assessment, which is a function of how much water do they contribute to the drain. And then, if appropriate, properties are also assigned a benefit assessment, which is a function of how much value they derive from the presence of the drain. So how much does the construction of the drain that we're proposing benefit these particular properties? That's the question that the engineer has to ponder and then make a decision on and try to quantify in terms of benefit assessments. The other piece that's worth mentioning is that where a drain runs into a public utility or a roadway, because usually those construction costs are considerably higher, the Drainage Act directs that the increased cost to deal with that utility or that road is assessed under Section 26 of the Drainage Act to that road. So for example, on this project, where we begin at the downstream end with the ditch, we continue up to the property line between the former Richard Good property and Morris Goods property. And there the drain will become a pair of pipes. And then once we get to Bleams Road, we have to bore under Bleams Road, which is a more expensive undertaking. So the region, as the owner of that road, pays the cost for that, the extra cost for that. And likewise, when we're into the highway allowance, we're using higher strength pipe, which has a higher cost. Some of those extra costs are paid for by the highway. So those are the guiding sort of principles, if you will, under the Drainage Act for assessing cost. And the nuts and bolts of how we go about doing it then is we take the entire project and we split it into subsections, and we call those intervals. And the concept of splitting the whole project into subsections is that it allows us to more equitably distribute the cost, especially the outlet assessment, to landowners whose water only makes use of a portion or a certain subsection of the project, right? So for illustration, near the downstream end of the project, these lands here, for example, Wilmot Mennonite Church, their contribution to this project is only an outlet assessment. There's no benefit to them for the project, but they have 0.2 hectares of land that flows into the drain, but it only flows into a downstream portion of the drain. So they're not assessed for any cost for work that's upstream of Bleams Road or upstream of where their water gets into the drain. They're only assessed for the portion of the drain that they use. So that's one of the approaches that we take, and that's true for each of the properties in the watershed. Outlet assessments are based on how much of the drain you use. So your outlet assessment, if you're near the downstream end of the drain, tends to be less, even if it's a sizable parcel. So you could have 15 hectares near the downstream end, that only pays into a portion of the drain. So the cost of the drain that you make use of is considerably less than a 15-hectare chunk near the top end, which makes use of the entire length of the system. So hopefully that makes sense. So a 15-hectare parcel near the top end would contribute to each interval as we work our way downstream through it. So that's one of the sort of techniques we use to try to distribute the cost in a fair way and make sure folks aren't paying into a part of the drain that they don't use. So those are the general principles that I use. And then two other final comments, and this is all detailed in my report, which perhaps everyone stayed up late last night reading. But if you didn't, I'll just quickly pull that up here on the screen as well. So we have the explanation of how assessments are calculated on page 19. And then there's two different types of outlet, or two different types of benefit that are assessed under this project. Something that I refer to as direct outlet. So when a municipal drain goes in, properties suddenly have access to a direct connection to a drainage system that runs across other private lands, but they have a legal access to that to direct their water there. So there's a benefit to those properties for having a direct connection and not having to deal with the future uncertainty of how their water is going to be dealt with downstream. So there's a benefit assessment under what I refer to as direct outlet. And then there's something called improved drainage. So by virtue of the project, we're improving the drainage system. So if it's an open ditch, then the improved drainage is a function of how much maintenance costs that personal landowner is going to save by not having to look after the ditch with everybody else's water in it over the life of the drain. And if it's a pipe, the improved drainage is a function of the benefit that that person gets for the improved convenience of making use of the land, the added available land for agricultural purposes, if that's the case, and those sorts of things. And the way I calculate on this project benefit for the properties receiving what we refer to as an enclosure of the open ditch to a pipe, and that would be Morris Good and Stuart Snyder's land. The extra cost that's involved to put the water in a pipe versus just having it be in a ditch here, that extra cost for Morris's property south of Bleams Road, Stewart's property north of Bleams Road, as well as the MTO owned parcel just south of the highway, that extra cost to enclose the drain is assessed as benefit, improved drainage benefit to those lands. So I think with that, I guess finally the other stop on our tour this morning in the report would be a section known as Appendix A, which is a very exciting name for this segment of the report. But what it does is it illustrates how for each segment of the drain, we've computed what are the cost of the allowances, what's the cost of the construction, what's the engineering cost to work through that piece, and then administrative costs is section 73. And it illustrates for each interval how much is benefit and how much is outlet. And there's a couple of pages, 28 and 29, that show that breakdown in detail for how the assessments were arrived at. And the final comment I'll make, and then we can open it up for discussion or other presentations, would be if the Court of Revision opts to make any adjustments to assessments this morning, for example, reducing one party's assessment by, we'll just pick a number, $1,000, then another party's assessment on this project will need to increase by that same amount. So the overall estimated cost of the project where we sit today is $622,000. So adjustments to assessments at the end of this exercise will need to total $622,000, but there can be some shifting of costs or assessments if the Court of Revision in the course of this discussion makes that decision. So with that, I'll wrap up my remarks, and then would it be helpful for me to continue sharing the screen and putting the map back on the screen? I don't mind doing that as we continue.
Well, I think it's probably a good idea to have it at least handy anyway. We can start with, I guess, comments from Mr. Steckley, as we don't have any appellants for the appeals for this, so we can maybe allow people to address the court as to what their interest is. So we can start, we'll start with Mr. Steckley. You were first to speak, so
Thank you.
go ahead, Ross.
If it please the court, we ask that you seriously consider some level of reduction in a form that's allowable within the laws of the land, as well as may be guided or suggested by members here today that have some influence upon final decisions. I'm speaking on behalf of an elderly couple. William currently shares the property with his wife, Miriam, her nickname Mim. Most local folks may know her by that name. They reside in the property. There's a farm residence there with some smaller shed type structures, and immediately to the east there had been an additional property on Gingrich Road facing some frontage that had been reduced of the Millers, and as a result of some clarification that had been removed from the property. Obviously, Bill and Mim's property is too large and does in fact drain as suggested here. One of the challenges that we have in all of these kinds of assessments is that we have to measure science against engineering standards. And I think that the engineers have done a fine job here in trying to mitigate and work with the owners. So we have no challenge with that whatsoever. Unfortunately, what we have is an elderly couple that has no desire to move. Housing is extremely difficult to find in an affordable way for elderly couples. And at this time, although the properties have appreciated much in time, the couple does not want to move. We believe that the engineers have been helpful. The assessment in the two properties that are registered on your report, these are not large amounts by consideration, say, compared to the Snyders and Goods further downstream, however, large enough to impact the couple. So what we're considering is that they had worked diligently and caught through great anxiety. The reason that I'm involved as a local nonprofit asked if I'd assist in some way, so I agreed to do that. But we were wondering if there's any room within the language of the documents or the opportunity to amend that the court consider a reduction of 10 to 15% on the assessment. And there are several reasons for that. One is the current fear that the couple has as it relates to some added costs. We recognize the engineers wisely have put consideration in there for the construction costs. My background is 40 years of construction, and budgets don't always quite line up like they are. And we're also suggesting that because of the beginnings of this drainage system sits on almost a gravel pit, and unfortunately Joel and K-Smart does not have boreholes testing and sciences that could prove this. He has to use a measurement that's given as best practices. So without further ado, our suggestion is that we just, it's in your court that you would have that lateral movement, because from an engineering perspective, Joel would not have, lack of a better word, proof or science to back any reductions than he's already done for us and on our behalf, which was appreciated through, included a field visit of which I attended with some neighbors. And so having said that, we're just a bit concerned with the timing of construction costs. I remain in the business, and it seems every budget always goes up. So we're almost suggesting this to a certain extent, that because as these numbers increase, those costs will be billed to the owners. So hopefully there's a zero balance no matter what succumbs. And we're in no way in grievance against what is being done here today. So that's my presentation for the Wikers.
Okay, thank you, Ross. Morris, do you wish to address? Have any comments? If you're trying to speak to us, Morris, you are muted, so. Okay, well,
Okay,
there we go.
okay, Mr. Mayor?
Yes,
Yeah, I think our engineer has done a tremendous job. It's not a small task to allocate these, the drainage, but I think he has done a very good job, and I'm concerned that we can go through with this project, and so is Mr. Snyder. And we appreciate what he has done, and we hope it can move forward.
okay, thank you. Okay,
Pardon me, through you, Chair Armstrong.
Yep.
Mr. Miller, if you could perhaps maybe stop sharing your screen for a moment so that the chair can see the all of the attendees better. And then if we need the map, we can pull it up if needed. Thank you.
okay. Councillor Holman, you have a comment or question?
Thank you, through the chair. I've not attended many of these court of revisions in my time on council. Mr. Steckley commented on a 10% reduction and request with that. I'm just looking for staff to comment further on that in that process and just to gather more details on that request.
Through you, Chair Armstrong. So as Mr. Miller explained, if there is a 10% reduction, which would be from the net amount, about a $400 and some odd reduction would be 10%. I work on the word side of the building, not the math side. Then that $400 net would need to be increased for somebody else's assessment. Okay, so historically, when staff has held court of revisions, we have heard more on a case of, shall we say, merit, engineering merit, as opposed to compassion. So that's something for council to keep in mind. Yeah, as we said, usually it's based on merit and perceived benefit, shall we say. So that would be the court's reasoning on this one is compassion. So it's a slightly different one than staff is accustomed to. However, obviously still worthy of consideration. So.
Okay, Councillor Holman, you don't have any follow-up? Good.
Through you, Mayor Armstrong, could I just follow up on what Don mentioned there?
Go ahead, Mr. Miller.
Yeah, as Mr. Steckley alluded to, initially the way this Wiker farm was assessed was the way other farmland is assessed further downstream in the watershed. using what we call a runoff factor of 1.0, which is our standard practice in Drainage Act work for agricultural land in the vicinity of municipal drains. Once I'd met with the Wikers and done further site visit, the approach I took with the farmland that you see here was to assess that 15.3 hectares and 1.9 hectares at a factor of 0.5. So it was reduced from 1.0 to 0.5, and 0.5 is the standard factor we use when we have areas of land that contribute less runoff, such as marsh or wooded areas, or in this case, very porous gravelly soils. So that was the decision that I made in the course of preparing the report. As Mr. Steckley alluded to, we don't do geotechnical analysis for drain reports throughout watersheds. The cost would just be prohibitive to do extensive soil testing and analysis throughout for each parcel. And so that is not the practice. However, if there's a reduction made on any grounds, it would perhaps recognize the fact that there is some approximation or rules of thumb involved in using those factors of 1.0 or 0.5.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have any comments or questions?
I was just going to, if I'm allowed to respond, although our plea is based on compassionate grounds, the reality is simply that we're in a housing crisis, and that we're dealing with a couple here that if they were charged to move and find a location, I mean, it's just not the appropriate time for them. And I know that timing was not initiated by them. So we're asking that as a result of the lack of housing provided by the municipalities and the broader province as a whole, we need to accommodate individuals, and that's my plea on their behalf.
Okay, thank you. I guess the other option is that somebody steps up and volunteers to take that, to cover that cost. Okay. So the next item is that we have a recommendation, and the recommendation that is before you is that the assessment contained in the report be upheld.
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor.
You
Do I
go
have
ahead.
a chance to say anything? Do I have a chance to say anything?
You go ahead, Stuart.
Sure. Stuart Snyder here. I'm the bulk of the situation. I guess, first of all, I do want to acknowledge that I am probably, from the benefit portion of it, I am probably the biggest benefiter of the situation. I think it is a drain that has been, if you look, it's been in the process for probably 15 or 20 years through certain situations. John Kunze from K-Smart basically told me one time it's high time this is put to rest and done properly. My whole concern is the entire cost. Yes, I cannot argue with that. I look at the proportions that are put to everybody, and I try and look towards the future, and I can see the MTO, the region, and unfortunately as a township, they will be contributing more of a water supply to the situation down the road. MTO talked about possibly a clover leaf up in Nafsinger in 7 and 8. We do know the township, the Schmidt lands will be developed at one point in time, and that water has to go somewhere also. And I guess I am not I'm not appealing anything. I'm very fortunate that nobody has appealed the drain, because it is going to be a benefit to all of us under soil conservation, weed control, and just proper being good stewards of the land. We've got washouts on the current ditch that's there now. It's got to be maintained every time. Every time it's cleaned out, we will have more erosion going down downstream into the river bottom and everything like that. So I think in the long term, it's got to be done. But I guess my thoughts are, I agree with Mr. Steckley that a 10 to 15% reduction in the costs of everybody down the whole stream. And I guess, unfortunately, I would like to see that put up to the MTO and the region and the township, unfortunately. The comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Middleholtz?
Thank you. Through you, Chair Armstrong. So at this point in time, the members of the court, Councilors Hallman and Councilor Fisher, as well as yourself, have the opportunity to make comments and ask questions. As well, the recommendation that is included on the agenda was that the assessments contained in the report be upheld. However, the members of the court do have the option to put forth a different motion if that is how they feel. So if they have some questions, some scenarios they wish to ask of either the engineer or staff, now would be the time to do so in consideration of the request being made from the public. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hallman, go ahead.
Thank you through the chair. So I'm processing all of this, and as Mr. Goodhead mentioned, I'm sorry, I think it was Mr. Goodhead mentioned, is it possible for us to write a letter of appeal to the MTO and to the region, and I guess bring it to the floor of council about that request and just kind of evaluate it in that way?
Go ahead, Ms. Middleholtz.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Armstrong, or Chair Armstrong, what we would do in this situation like this. So as I said, suppose there was the, and just again, I'm looking at the assessment here. The amount that I gave before was included a 1/3 grant that is through OMAFRA. However, municipalities as well as the province would not be subject to that same assessment. So even though, yes, we would be taking, $400 some odd off of their net assessment, the amount onto to the shall we say public entities would be more in the 600 some odd. So if hypothetically this amount was to be distributed amongst the region, MTO, and the Township of Wilmot, we would have to schedule a second quarter revision whereby the region and the MTO would be given notice that their assessments are being suggested to be increased by X amount of dollars. And then so that they have the opportunity to speak to that. Okay, so that would be the process that we would undertake. It would be a second quarter revision, same staff, the engineer would be in attendance, members of the public also, or anybody who's been assessed has the opportunity to attend as well. We have done that once in the past. I can recall where assessments were adjusted. And yes, it was towards the region, and the region did attend the second meeting. So that is what would happen in that sort of a situation. So is it possible? Yes, but that would be what the process that we would undertake.
Thank you for that explanation. I'm going to let Councillor Fisher speak and kind of process that.
Go ahead, Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, through you, Mayor Armstrong. I'd like to hear what Mr. Miller's comments are, and I think myself, when we're dealing with a quarter revision, it's important to be fair to everyone. Mm-hmm. I know there's a compassionate thing here, but if we give somebody less, then somebody else has to pay, and I'm not sure about that approach myself. But I'd like to hear what Mr. Miller's comments are if you've experienced this many times before.
Okay, and I think maybe we should try and get an exact amount of what we're dealing with, if we can. Go ahead, Mr. Miller.
Through you, Chair Armstrong, thank you. So if we were to, there have been two different suggestions made. One by Mr. Steckley for a 10 to 15% reduction for the assessments to the Weicker properties. And then another by Stuart Snyder for a sort of across the board 10 to 15% reduction, more or less for all the privately owned lands in the watershed, with the change then being shifted to the public entities. It'll be easier to chat about the Weickers suggestion here initially. So a 10 to 15% reduction out of about a grand total amount that they owe of, well, for easy math, we'll just say it's $4,500, which would be 675 if we used 15% of what they've as a reduction request that they've listed. That would be a $675 reduction of the two properties together. We would compute each property individually, but just for discussion, a grand total of just under $700 coming down. And as Dawn mentioned, if other properties assessments are increased who are not present in party to this hearing, then there would need to be a second quarter revision. If the assessment reduction that's granted to one party is added to an entity that's present here at this meeting, then there wouldn't be a need for a second quarter revision. So if it were added to, for example, the Township, or if it were added to Mr. Snyder or Mr. Good, who are here and they're willing to accept the increase, then we'd be done at this stage with the process under the Drainage Act. If we did an across the board factored down reduction of 10 or 15% to everyone, or we opted, for example, to increase the assessment to MTO, that was the court's decision, then the process would be as Dawn described. A second quarter revision would be held, and I would be instructed to prepare a revised assessment schedule that shows the reduced assessments, the increased assessments, and that revised assessment schedule with the notice would be sent to all parties, and then there'd be a second quarter revision held if the party getting the increase is not present today. So, and then I've up till now avoided answering directly the question you asked, Mr. Fisher, which is, in my experience, you know, I think it really lies with the Court of Revision, based on what they've heard, to decide, you know, how to respond to the requests that have been made. Fairness is fundamental, and so it is important to do what can be done to treat everyone the same, and that's the duty that I have under my report. I think for the Court of Revision, you can only make decisions based on what's been asked of you. So only three parcels are represented here today. And so I don't know that there'd be there's no obligation on the Court of Revision to go beyond what's been asked for to reduce, you know, assessments across the board for everyone. I would suggest if a particular request has been made and you feel there's merit in that request based on what I've said or what Mr. Steckley has said, I have no problem with an adjustment being made to the assessments to the Weicker parcel or to any of the other parcels that are represented here that have presented information that you feel is worth considering. I think it's important that you just then decide, you know, if reductions are made, what's a fair rationale to shift that increased cost to somebody else. And if it's, you know, future increased water or those sorts of things, those are hard to quantify where we sit today, but that can be a reason.
Thank you. Follow up, Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Mayor Armstrong. The other thing we have to consider too is the amount of cost for Mr. Miller to process everything again, get all staff back here again. we have to look at a lot of those costs, but I would be prepared to make a motion to pass this as it stands. I'm not sure how Councillor Hallman feels about that, but
sorry, I just dropped my pen through the chair. After hearing Mr. Miller's comments and processing everything, it's heavy on my empathy part, but I think that we need to go forward with how it was presented.
Okay, thank you. So I'm taking that Councillor Fisher, you're moving the motion as the recommendation, and seconded by Councillor Hallman. And all in favor? That is carried. Thank you. So that ends our Court of Revision. So the last recommendation that the Court of Revision adjourn, and that is moved by Councillor Hallman, second by Councillor Fisher. All in favor? That is carried. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and everybody can go and enjoy the rest of your day.